Hello again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Tatiana Kluvánková, and I'm welcoming you at the session, which is a session Ecological Economics for Earth System Governance in Turbulent Times. History of this session has been quite long. There has been many years that Earth System Governance and Ecological Economics are discussing how to interlink and how to collaborate in this field. So it's kind of very overlapping communities. And I'm very grateful to offer you today this session that is discussing the possible cooperation and how these two large research platforms can interfere. Ecological economics is a transdisciplinary science that addresses the coevolution of natural ecosystems and human societies within the Earth system and underlines their spatial and temporal interdependencies. It also contributes to the addressing ongoing global challenges in turbulent times, in particular by integrating economic activity, biodiversity conservation, or climate governance in a way that promotes human well-being, sustainability, and justice. In particular, a very interesting possible collaboration is now in the area of bioeconomy in a post-COVID social recovery. In our session today, we will address two questions. The question is how ecological economics and Earth system governance can address ongoing global challenges of turbulent times. That's a very important one question. And how to trigger individual and societal behavior change to transformation towards global sustainability in the present Earth crisis. So these are two, overlapping kind of overall questions. And I am very pleased to introduce you our panelists. We have two panelists. We have Roldan Murdian, who is now president of the International Society for Ecological Economics. He's coming from the field of ecosystem service governance, and this is also the talk that he will address. And then we have Juha Hiedanpää, who is a research professor also in natural sciences and environmental policy. He's coming from Finland, and he's coming from the European Society for Ecological Economics. And his talk will be in strategic biodiversity conservation. And then in the discussion, we have two discussants that will help us to frame the discussion. And that is Volker Mauerhofer and Julia Mildorfova Leventon. So they are two ecological economists working in this field, and they are very pleased now to come with the discussion. So the strategy is that we first ask the panelists to present their stand. Please keep 20 minutes time, and then we open the discussion for everyone, including our discussant. And you may pose your questions anytime during the talks in a question answer time place, and we will read the question and we'll approach your question with the panelist. Now I'd like to invite Juha first to talk and to give his talk. And so welcome here, and Juha is here on site. So that's a really hybrid session. That's also the reason why we are a little bit late. So we apologize for a delay, but some technology was breaking our plans. And Juha is on site, so I very much welcome him here to present his talk. Enjoy.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, technical issues continue. Finally. I'll try once again. And now there's no echo. Now it's good. Okay, I'm so pleased to be here. As Tatiana introduced, I'm a member of the European Society for Ecological Economics and have been there as a board member for quite some time. And what I'm presenting now is, it's not a thought experiment and it's not exactly retrospective, but I think it's a research coming along. So in the near future, this is something that I would be with my colleagues doing rather seriously. So strategic biodiversity conservation. And as Tatiana pointed out, these first two questions there, for me, this time of turbulent times, it's like, it's more or less, I'm not saying that this is exactly the normal, but as I look back these times, so there's always some sort of disturbance, always financial crisis or some sort of issue. So rarely, at least when I've been choosing my research topics, it's never calm. There's always issues. So it's a politics and economics of disturbance and how institutional designers and policymakers are facing that the disturbance that has been interesting me for a while. And now thinking what's specific for ecological economics. For me here, I brought these two concepts with me, which are not that much used in ecological economics, but I brought them here anyway. Constraint, that's something that has caused a lot of confusion and discussion in the ecological economics community, but especially in the institutional economics community. What are institutions constraints or are they something else? Here I took this approach that constraints are more or less what Karen yesterday said about how societies structure themselves for provisioning or normal life. Constraints are those channeling features of society. Like here, anything or process that reduces the likelihood of dynamics taking part. So you provide an enabling structure. So that's a constraint because it focuses the attention and intention. So that's why I like to discuss and use the concept of constraint. So, and those may be imposed or they may be emergent. And during these slides, I will show with examples what sort of emergent constraints appear. And institutional economist John Commons already some time ago introduced strategic and routine transactions. Strategic is something, that kind of action where limiting factor is taken into control, and then after that nature or functions take their course. It is simple, coming from perhaps from soil science of 100 years old anyway. And the other concept is affordance, coming from ecological psychology. It's something, it's good or bad possibility offered by the environment. And key here is the habit. It's habit that makes certain affordances tangible, convenient, and meaningful. Without habit, affordance is not recognized. So mostly I'm here today referring to affordances and constraints. And here are some influencers of that. But strategic, that does not come as a surprise that something soft, general, collaborative, future-oriented, and proactive. Of course, policies and hard institutions may be of that kind, but strategic is something which is done in collaboration and also executed in a co-creative manner. But I will give you an example for the beginning. It's about regional land use plan for southwestern Finland, and it was about natural values and natural resources. And there was this invention or innovation, strategic development principle, which is a strategic symbol, not constraining in a formal way, but focusing attention that, for example, one of these signs or symbols was continuous forest. So where's forest and valuable forest, it should remain as forest and not, for example, infrastructure site. So that was only idea behind it. It's strategic to put the attention that it's forest of valuable kind, because there was biodiversity values and regular forest values. And these were the findings that the planners, during this 5 years process, in a bottom-up manner, and we as researchers, we participated in this process. These are the strategically valuable forest areas that are not supposed to be protected in formal way, but kept as forest, regular forest. But what happened after 5 years of deliberation? Decision makers came along and decided, no, we are not going to allow these sort of strategic symbols, because in the end of the day, they will restrict constitutional right of private ownership. And the thing is that decision makers, they don't really have to give reasons why they think this way. But now it seems that there's somebody has taken this to the administrative court, so it may continue. And their reasons must be given why strategic symbols restrict constitutional rights. But this is familiar in every nature conservation case all over the globe, especially now in this my case in Finland and perhaps in Nordic countries. And it doesn't go back that long. For example, in Finnish case, it goes back plus 20 years. Why it is suspicious towards nature conservation? So it was more or less Natura 2000 implementation that caused major hassle back in Finland. And for example, my first studies were about hunger strikes of forest owners against this Natura 2000 planning. But we have come a long way from there to here biodiversity strategy of 2030 and forest strategy. So it's moving, this Natura 2000 hard legislation and regulation is moving towards becoming more strategic. And in this second example paper that I have there, I contrast forest programs and regional and national forest strategic forest planning with Natura 2000. And no surprisingly, there was no conflict with the forest planning because it was soft and strategic and didn't do any changes. It gathered stakeholders together to discuss, but didn't have effects in real life. That's why it was consensual, unlike Natura 2000. And a quick excursion to the species protection from biodiversity point of view. That's also important. And in Finnish case, the wolf is particularly exemplar case. There you have 3 points, 3 high peaks, and those high peaks are individual numbers of wolves in Finland, estimated number. And those peaks are after management plan process. those processes took few years. Again, collaboration, negotiation, coming up with soft things, soft designs. After those processes, everything looked fine. Wolf population size had increased. But as you see, what happened immediately after the implementation of management plan, of these strategic symbols, what happened after that, in the wolf case, population size came down. And there are various issues that were there affecting what happened after soft processes. I'm not going to go into detail, but it seems that strategic processes started finally, and then, let's say, the affordances that were given to rural people, perhaps mostly hunters, and also administrators, pointed to the direction that wolf can be hunted again. If the population size is this high, it can't be hunted, and by that means we get acceptance to wolf presence in Finland. But it seems that these constraints or designs and affordances, bad habits from the point of view of wolf, in this case, didn't sort of, or they matched up problematically, and the wolf population, now it's increasing, but as you see the last one there, running process of new managerial hunt for the wolf is on its way. So there are people who think that population size may come down again, even though the managerial hunting is based on sustainability principles. And here's one example of paper that I wrote with my colleague. We tried to understand what we call pre-adaptive transactions, how this wolf-critical civil society influences other civil society members and groups, but especially decision makers. They're primed decision makers to act in a certain way, which is problematic from the wolf point of view, which again points to certain problematic affordances. Okay, now let's go back to this day. And in Finland, we have, not under the pressure of EU legislation, but this whole global biodiversity concern, we have two major legislations in renewal: Nature Conservation Act and Land Use and Building Act. And of course, they do have connections to forest policy and forest legislation. But what's happening in this very recent renewal of Nature Conservation Act? I just take two more or less strategic findings or happenings there. So ecological compensation will be written most likely to the legislation, but also voluntary compensation. So not only mandated by, let's say, Natura 2000 site distractions, but also voluntary. And then biodiversity strategy and action plan will be more thoroughly implemented on national scale. But what has been under discussion is how to do it on site, meaning on regional level. And I was a member in a scientific advisory board for this law renewal. And during the process, the role of regional activity and regional actions were diminished. Now, in this proposal, it's said that it's optional to do regional implementation plan for biodiversity strategy, which from the strategic point of view and from the point of view of biodiversity conservation is not the good news. But this is the pressure that I illustrated with this Natura 2000 case, and also with the case that dealt with regional land use plan in Southwest Finland. This indicates the pressures that there are, or interest struggles that there are in Finland facing biodiversity conservation still. And the other one, Land Use and Building Act. Again, regional land use planning is becoming more strategic, even though it's already strategic. But like this, my example showed, it's bit the good intentions bringing biodiversity conservation on the regional level with that instrument. It's a bit problematized because of hesitance of decision makers to really assign to that symbol, for example, this development principle symbol. So it doesn't really do the work of protecting biodiversity if those strategic symbols or instruments are not accepted. And what has happened here is this wider plan level that comes from above master plan and below regional plan. It has been wiped away, but this would have been important for urban biodiversity. Now it's off-written from the proposal, more or less. And what is important here is this green structure. As this example of regional land use plan and the strategic symbol that were introduced and then not accepted. What is that if it's not a green structure indicator? So even though it's written in the Nature Land Use and Planning Act, there's still some hesitancy on the ground level to implement it and use it. And if we think about the time scale, it really will take a few decades to get them planted on regional plans, because this one was now wiped off. But then, okay, Nature Conservation Act, Land Use and Building Act, they necessarily won't help that much. And as I said 20 years ago, these forest programs and regional forest programs, they really didn't do their work because they didn't have any mandate or constraining force. But now, surprisingly, things are changing. First, the Forest Act was renewed in 2014. Now it's allowing more diverse forest management or silvicultural practices than before. For example, continuous forest cover management was prohibited, but now for 7 years it has been allowed, even encouraged in certain cases. But what's most important here is that these regional forest programs, they do have an innovation. Already then, when I studied those 20 years ago, they had preparation groups, and they prepared, or we prepared these management, these forest programs for regional level, and then went home, and again, in 5 years' time, we gathered and started to do it again. But this time, the innovation is that these preparation groups turned to implementation groups. Same people started to implement also these actions that were co-created during this 3 years process prior to 2021. So speaking on behalf of biodiversity and legislative changes that's happening in Finland, it seems that the most promising from the biodiversity point of view is this old, still perhaps a bit problematic forest law that enables strategic actions on a regional level to work for biodiversity. Yeah, sorry, this is in Finnish, but it illustrates that there are 4 implementation groups: wood, non-wood, environment, which explains themselves rather well, and then in the middle, communication. So this is rather promising. And now, having looked back, I will just a second. Midterm. So, do we get institutions or laws right in Finland? So, because now is the moment we are renewing these laws. And then, as the legislative framework is in order from the biodiversity point of view, allowing strategic action, then we fix with behavior, forest owners' behavior, and start nudging habits and co-creating better affordances. Or does it go the other way around? So that now in midterm, in a few years' time, we really have to start doing these nudges and affordances and these processes. And it seems that by a forest law, we are in Finland approaching this way. And legislation will catch up later if biodiversity is not that seriously written into these proposals that are in consideration right now. And I just want to conclude that whichever way it is, the future will not be built on routine transactions, meaning that hoping for the best, that whatever we do in forest and however we plan our symbols and execute them, biodiversity will take care of itself, because it doesn't, because these constraints and affordances need to be changed. So I thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Very nice talk. And we have Juha also here in the room, but I suggest that we ask first the second panelist, and then we open the floor for questions. But you still, from online environment, you still can be sending ask questions to question answers, and we will address them later. So please, Roldan, the floor is yours.
Hello, well, thank you very much for the invitation, and let's hope that it works. I just first wanted to check that you can hear me well. Can somebody confirm that the sound is okay?
Yes, you are very nicely here in the room, so everybody can hear you perfectly well.
Okay, so I hope I will not take too much time. Please let me know when my time is over. Well, I'm going to give a presentation which somehow is a summary of a paper which was recently published in Ecological Economics. Down below, this is the first slide is the reference. So if you are more interested in this subject, please look at this publication. Because it's very difficult to talk about it in only 20 minutes or 15 minutes. My presentation will be rather theoretical and, let's say, philosophical. And I will talk about the limitation of the concept of ecosystem services in establishing governance regimes, and the usefulness of this concept in governance regimes. In particular, from the perspective of what is going on in Brazil nowadays. So the next slide, please. So, as you know, any governance regime is built on three interrelated pillars, and we should never forget that governance regimes reflect our social convention and our culture, and so they are based on worldviews, on moral systems, and of course discourse. And that's probably has been the main contribution of ecosystem services as a notion, is to create a new discourse that was created with intention, to provide new ways of governing the natural environment. However, what I'm going to argue is that this notion actually is part of our worldview and model system, and that worldview and model system are that creates a kind of paradox, because despite these new discourse, if we continue with our worldview model system as they are today, we will not solve our global environmental crisis. I'm assuming here that the global environmental crisis has deep cultural causes, and is very much entrenched in our Western culture, Western culture and global capitalism, which of course is very much also based on our cultural premises. So, worldviews and moral systems ultimately determine the way we allocate rights. And you have already mentioned some authors from institutional economics, and I think that the main insights from institutional economics is that the way we organize not only our society and our governance regimes, but also the economic systems ultimately depends on the way we allocate rights. And the way we allocate rights, of course, is not rational in the sense that it's just a social convention that reflect our worldviews and our model systems. The next slide, please. So if we want to talk about, if we want to change our governance regimes, we have to think about the way we allocate rights. And for example, I like the example that you had mentioned about the wolf in Finland, and it's a very interesting example because it raises the issue. What are the rights of the wolf? Who decides the rights of the wolf, and who represents the rights of the wolf? And to what extent that those rights of the wolf can be changed in a democratic system without consultation with the wolf. And it shows very well how, for example, the governance of the wolf population depends very much the way we allocate rights to non-human species. So the point is that the notion of ecosystem services is associated with a particular discourse and a way of representing the world. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time in this presentation to talk about that, but in the paper I mentioned before, we developed this a bit further. And well, I think that there are mainly three tenets that define Western culture, and I think this is utilitarianism, anthropocentrism, and human nature duality. And of course, the next slides. And I think that these three tenets are the basis of our of the global environmental crisis we have produced as a civilization, as a society. So in that sense, the ecosystem services notion is a kind of continuation of these principles. And the key assumption of the ecosystem services approach is that, as I see it, is that the main cause of environmental problems is basically a governance failure due to a lack of information. Basically, the ecosystem services approach assumes that our incapacity to conserve biodiversity, for example, is due to the fact that we there is a lack of information of decision makers about the benefits that biodiversity provides to society. So in that sense, it's of course very utilitarian and trying to justify environmental protection based on utility humans derive from it. It also assumes a rational decision making in the sense that, well, once this information is provided, it assumes somehow that decision makers will take that into consideration. And you have mentioned some examples of that. I mean, what expectation of rational decision making of Finnish decision makers. that we as scholars, we expect that once we provide information and knowledge, decision makers will take this and will take better decisions based on evidence and filling this governance gap, filling this governance failure. That's why, for example, the policy agenda associated with the ecosystem services approach is basically the assessment and evaluation of ecosystem services and their incorporation into decision making. That's well, it's a nice theoretical framework, but actually it's increasingly detached from what is going on the ground. The next slide, please. So the main advantages of the notion of ecosystem services is that they show interdependency between agents, and that may be an interesting framework, for example, for encouraging collective action and making it also for making explicit dependency between stakeholders that often do not think that they are interrelated, and they are actually interrelated through ecosystem services, and that means through hidden costs and benefits. And well, as I said before, ecosystem services approach represent the most recent expression of utilitarian, what we might call utilitarian environmentalism. That is the hope that's showing the benefits that the natural environment provides to human societies. We can conciliate different motives for environmental protection. That's the whole expectation of utilitarian environmentalism. And this ideology has dominated sustainability science during the past, let's say, 20 decades or so, and including ecological economic thinking. The next slide. But the point is that this worldview strengthen human exceptionalism as and strengthen also an allocation of rights centered around the notion of human utility. So if we talk about the wolf in Finland, I mean, the rights of the wolf will depend very much on the services that the wolf provide to human society, measured through different methods. But again, there is a kind of hierarchical relationship between humans and the wolf, and that's what we call human receptionism. Which is, well, just to say that it is part of their anthropocentric worldview. The next slide. The point is that, and I'm talking now from this perspective from Brazil, I mean, it's like maybe you know, is that but since 2018 we have experienced a very dramatic progression of the environmental agenda in Brazil. That I don't have time to summarize what is going on, but basically there has been a very aggressive dismounting of environmental policies at the national level, and there has reduction of the monitoring and law enforcement capacity of the state, and they has resulted in a major increase in deforestation and large-scale massive fires in different ecosystems, among many other negative environmental impacts. So there has been a very concrete and very rapid progression of the environmental agenda, and that happened not only in Brazil, but also in the US during the Trump administration. The main difference is that Brazil, as you know, holds a very large share of the global biodiversity, including the very large part of the Amazon basin. So what happens here in Brazil has dramatic consequences for the whole world. Well, the point is that my interpretation is then that utilitarian environmentalism has not been able to stop this rise of this new social phenomenon that is that we can call anti-environmentalist movement. So from the instrumental point of view, I think we can shed some doubts about the effectiveness of the utilitarian approach. Just jumped the slides.
Just a second, please.
Yeah, and then the next step. So this called into question the utilitarian environmentalism, and we should, as academic community, because we have invested so much during the past 20 years in utilitarian environmentalism, I think this is time to what is going on in Brazil, and I think what is going on in Brazil reflects a global movement, and this associated to the rise of the extreme right at the global level. Calls into question this strategy, at least from a point of view of instrumental effectiveness for the promotion of the environmental agenda. So the next slide, please. And I said before, I mean, that philosophically speaking, not only from the instrumental point of view, but philosophically speaking, I think that there is also a kind of a structural contradiction in the ecosystem services approach, because it's based on the same precepts that drive our destructive relationship with the natural environment. It is based on these three pillars that I mentioned at the beginning: is utilitarianism, anthropocentrism, and human nature duality. The next slide, please. So there is this notion is problematic because of the ineffectiveness from the instrumental point of view, but also from a philosophical point of view, because it represents a kind of continuation. It's a new discourse, but that keeps the main key premises of our Western civilization that are responsible for massive destruction of the environment at the global level. So the point that I wanted to raise here in this presentation is that a truly transformative environmental governance will require significant changes in these three pillars, not only in the discourse, but also in the worldview and in the model systems. And the next slide, please. I will have no time, of course, to develop these ideas further, and I just wanted to finish now by just pointing what are the ways forward, well, in my vision, for achieving a really transformative governance, not only at the national but also the global level. And I think that it has to do basically with the reallocation of rights. And as mentioned before, we cannot change governance significantly without changing the allocation of rights. And it has to do with, for example, the extension of the community's justice and the allocation of rights to non-human entities and ecosystems. And there are already some examples about that in New Zealand, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and other countries, about national legislation that have given rights not only to ecosystems, but also to non-human species. And the second point that Juha also mentioned, that we have to shake our convention about private property rights. So from a different worldview, for example, from the property rights on forests didn't exist in Brazil before the arrival of the Portuguese. And it still is very rare among indigenous communities. And of course, in these territories, the forest has been conserved for thousands of years without property rights. And that then calls into question the way we allocate property rights. And then I don't have time to develop it, but in the paper we do it a bit, is that we need a shift from a model system based on the notion of utility to a model system based on the notion of care. And these are quite very difficult principles for developing governance regimes and legislations. For example, in the Western culture, is very different the way we deal with the legislation about children than as compared to the legislation about wolves, for example, or just to mention one species that has been mentioned before. Basically, because they are based on this and human exceptionalism, there's a big difference, this duality between non-human and human species with regards to rules, social norms, and the community justice legislation. So, in essence, just to summarize, I think that we need to end human exceptionalism as the key principle shaping our governance regimes. And then with this, I would like to end. Thank you very much again for your attention and for the invitation.
Yes, thank you very much. Very nice two talks, both in targeting the biodiversity governance and very interesting. Yes, I like to open the floor for discussion. Lost a bit of time, but I think we still can have a nice and interesting talk. I like to invite our two discussants. So maybe lady first. So Julia, if it is possible for you, we will be very happy to give you floor to react to those talks, and then Volker will follow. And you can also introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tatiana. If you can just give me a wave, Tatiana, if you hear me okay.
Yeah. 5 minutes would be fine for the first reaction. Then, of course, we can have a discussion.
Yep, but you hear me, that's good. So thank you very much for those talks, Roldan and Juha, that was really interesting. I wanted to try and address sort of one of the, or two of the core key questions that we were given for this session. So how do ecological economics and earth system governance address ongoing global challenges? And how do we trigger this transformation in behavioral and social change? And so to do that, I wanted to try and show what I think the links or the key points that we come together across the ecological economics and the earth system governance communities are. And to do that, I'm just going to show you, I hope you can see my little diagram here. This is my systems diagram because we're talking about earth systems governance. So I'm going to sort of draw on systems thinking a little bit. And when we talk about systems, we can talk about system properties and we can say, okay, they have a paradigm and that tends to shape the structures that are within them and that shapes what processes are happening within the system. And we can also talk about the materials in the system. And I wonder if you can actually see that at all. Hang on. Yeah, so that's our systems. And very simplified from Donella Meadows' frameworks there. And I think that what we tend to think about when we talk about earth systems governance is we talk about questions of policy, we talk about questions of polity, and we talk about questions of politics. And we tend to, in my opinion, we tend to focus on these questions of structures and what's happening and how we govern, but within a sort of a dominant paradigm, which I think Roldan has made really clear in his presentation. We maybe need to rethink these paradigms that we're governing within so that we're moving away from this utilitarian way of thinking and provide new ways of governance, so to reshape this paradigm. And what I think Juha also showed is that how those paradigms really shape those structures and those policies and the processes and what's happening within there. And so I think what we should be doing as a community is really starting to question how we come together here. So bringing our understandings of politics and polity into rethinking that paradigm. What does that paradigm need to be? Who decides? And then moving that into questions of, and how do we govern within this paradigm? What do our governance systems look like? What are our structures and our processes within this new paradigm? so that we're not just sort of uncritically finding new ways to govern within a discourse that's leading us away from sustainability. I would leave us there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting reaction and summarization of two talks. Volker? And I just wanted to add that Julia is working on the Czech Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Czech Globe in Prague. That's kind of interdisciplinary institute targeting on mostly on climate and global change. And Volker, yes?
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name is Volker Mauerhofer. I'm a chair at Mitzvah University, environmental science with a specialization on social science. Background from the education is biology, ecological economics, and laws. And I'm also in the board of the International Society of Ecological Economics, and I'm also vice president of the International Society of Development Research. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer to those two very interesting talks. I would also like to start my first statement actually with overall addressing the two main questions. So the challenges in turbulent times, which both groups can together address. And here I want to refer to the turbulent times, which is, I think, meant the Corona times particularly. And it's often mentioned that this has a background in a sort of biodiversity crisis also, that our species are threatened, species are hunted, species are consumed, and species come on markets together where they should not play together, yeah, on the market table. And that was also taken up by UNEP General Director Inga, who had said nature sent a sign with Corona. Yeah, so it's the crisis is based on biodiversity deterioration, and others made the link to climate with regard to the measures which were necessary. And I think both networks are really complementary in their approach. The Earth System Governance Network is particularly strong, I think, in this policy issues which were mentioned also by Julia, actually, and particular good also in issues to come back to a framework which was recently published by Roque and Reichert. So policy mixes versus instrument mixes. And I think both presentations had also issues of policy mixes in there and issues of instrument mixes. Instrument mixes would be the interplay between our norm incentivized instruments or economic incentivized instruments or information incentivized instruments, while policy mixes provide more the framework around those instrument mixes. So here, both societies could really complementary act and provide our insights together how crises like this Corona crisis or future crisis could be better addressed. So, and I think both speakers also had here already valuable elements in. Then look at the 5 minutes, because I think, Julia, you stayed on 2 or 3 minutes, but I will not consume your 2 minutes extra. So the second point is that both address this issue of human-centered governance, which is currently the main dominant frame. And both mentioned also the issue of right distribution. And of course, politics and parliaments define also that the distribution of rights, but we have also other right systems thinking about indigenous people. So we are here also in concrete distribution of powers, what is allowed by whom to do. And it's not only about material rights, but we have also to think about procedural rights, because here, for example, also nature needs representatives because nature has no voice in itself. So we have to think about who represents these rights, and there are quite some new approaches out there, like the Aarhus Convention, which is now 20 years ongoing, but which found, for example, a sister agreement in Latin America already with the Escazú agreement, and that's really recent concrete politics. And the Aarhus Convention in Europe was now implemented by the European Union and brought extreme dynamics in this issue of rights and who has standing on behalf of nature. So this is really something also both organizations, I think, are good in, to think about what these concrete rights could mean in overall politics or also with regard to ecological economics instruments. So I leave it as a first statement with this, and I have for each of the speakers then special comments also. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Volker. Now I want to ask, would you like to react to these two statements now, the both speakers? And do we have, Natalia, some questions from audience? Not yet. Okay, so I mean, you can react. I mean, it's your...
Just a quick response. It was, yeah, this issue of rights. That's the core, you know, if you are looking from institutional point of view, or if you are looking from ecological economics point of view, that's the core. I do agree with Roland on that. But it's okay, working on a ground, trying, you know, to fix things and trying to understand why these particular decision makers do such decisions, or why do they justify their decisions such and such manner. And that I was thinking this as I was listening to Julia's great comment, you know, about paradigms and these bigger issues. So I noticed that I don't think, I don't stop to think those issues that often. I should think more about paradigms and big issues, big stuff, and not you know, just trying to deal with these issues at hand. That was a good reminder to me that, you know, also those big issues, even though the right concept of right and practice, especially, that came to my mind from Volker's point, that what I've been trying to do is not to do theory of rights, but how these rights are practiced in particular cases. And that's I have found that rewarding and also a very tricky field of study, you know, how these are exercised, these rights. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much. You can stay. Roldan, any reaction from your side to any point or piece of information? And
well, I just wanted to thank both Julia and Volker for the very fruitful comments, and you know, I very much agree with both of them. And so I just wanted to mention that here in Brazil nowadays, and as we talk, there is a clash between worldviews and model systems that also have to do with allocation of rights. For example, is now under discussion in the Congress a revision of the indigenous land legislation, which in Brazil gained constitutional status in 1988. I mean, the right of the indigenous population to have a particular territory as their own, and that's very much questioned nowadays by the government and by a large share of the MPs and members of the parliament. The issue is how to take it in a democratic setting, these kind of decisions involving rights, because as you know, but the indigenous representation in the parliament is very small, if not insistent or even non-existent at all. And what we're discussing the Parliament is discussing is precisely the rights. There are rights to have land. So it's a paradox of a democratic setting, and we don't have yet definitive answers for that. But I think it's nice to look what is going on in Brazil, and I think that indigenous population have more chances to win this clash if they appeal to the notion of rights, instead if they appeal to the notion of the utility or the ecosystem services that indigenous land provide to the world. Of course, indigenous land provides several ecosystem services to the world and also to the national economy. But if they will have to choose a discourse on which to base their fight, and I think the effectiveness, the political effectiveness, the capacity to influence decision will be higher if they choose to take the side of rights, to defend their rights instead of defending the provision of ecosystem services to the world.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. So we are thinking, I mean, I like to ask, think that what we can address to the Earth system governance that could be a position of ecological economics in this direction to better policies, that this is the paradigm that is needed to be new and so on. But we have question now from audience, so I will read it. So the question is from Liz. I apologize if I misspelled the name. With your experience of the reversal of biodiversity support, how can we embed environmental values in youth culture, the decision makers of the future? So that's the question. I mean, you might see it in chat, I think, I hope so, but for the others. So who wants to answer? Anybody from our webinar, from the panelists and the discussant? So how to embed environmental values in youth culture and decision makers of the future.
I could start if nobody else wants.
Yes, please. Yeah.
It's a very interesting question because especially the youth have so many new opportunities to do in their leisure time things, yeah, particularly with the electronic media and so, and it's harder and harder to get youth interested into environment. But I think it's not to give up, but just to try harder to get more environmental information into schools, more opportunities for youth to learn about the environment. Yeah, how should somebody who grows up in the middle of Tokyo know about that there's something like environment outside? Yeah, I lived 2 years in Tokyo, and it's 35 million people, and for example, and the other problem is that the places where I lived, where I grew up, for example, in the green areas, disappeared in the last 30 years in my village. So we have two different strains. We have on the one hand more leisure time opportunities and less green space outside also, which is really a hindering factor for many youth to get in contact with environment. But I think environmental education through media, through schools, or other sorts of information are the key to get people interested that there's something out there beyond humanity. Yeah.
Yeah, but I may argue with you that I think that the youth is quite well aware of environment. So if you take Greta and all the climate,
climate.
Kids in the school, I think that's not absolutely hopeless story. I think, of course, that in some areas, yes, but I would argue with this that I don't think it's a problem with youth. I think it's more problem with a kind of productive population that is very materialistic oriented and not with the youth, I think. I don't know what the others say about that.
I would say something, if that's okay. I think I probably would say similar to Tatiana there, that actually I do see this uprising in the youth, and certainly the university students that I come into contact with are increasingly environmentally engaged, and school children that I speak to as well. But I think that this is really an interesting question that comes back to something that Juha said in his response to us a few minutes ago, that when you're on the ground, you don't often look up and question, okay, what rights are happening here? What paradigms am I working within? And I think you mentioned this as well in your presentation, Juha, around this sort of path dependency. We're sort of in this process of, this is the paradigm that we're operating in. And the longer it exists and the more that we structure ourselves within it, the less we are able to look up and look around. And I think that the danger is that the deeper we're in this paradigm and the more that we're structured to enact this sort of utilitarianism, it sort of removes these opportunities for next generations to interact with their environment. And you see things like the removal of parks and so on, Volker. But actually, I think this is why, for me, I quite like to see these activities that really seek to push against this and reintroduce people back into their natural environment. I sort of see it as a form of protest in getting people back into the natural world, running youth programs that take people out and inform and educate and put them back into rural environments, understand the way things are working, outdoor pursuit activities and so on. And I think that there's some really interesting research and practice emerging, particularly from the biodiversity community, around reconnecting to nature and what activities help us do that, to push against those dominant paradigms that we're sat within right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone else? To any, not only to the education and youth. We have some, maybe 5 questions, 5 minutes left, sorry, for the end of the session. Some closing.
And I agree on the climate issue and the Greta and all those this, but I think it's more anthropocentric than biodiversity. Biodiversity is not that ecocentric, not that anthropocentric, but it's more an ecocentric issue. Climate change, you can make people much stronger aware. It's a direct threat, yeah. But with biodiversity, it's much harder to get people aware of that we need biodiversity, and it's the network we are embedded in, yeah. So I understood the question really related to biodiversity. I fully agree on the awareness on climate change issues and on the increased movements from the youth side in climate change. So I think it's really there's quite a difference in there, but we can learn, I think, from the climate movement also for biodiversity.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. Any message final that we would like to address to Earth system governance?
I think that related to this issue, I mean, because there are a couple of things we have learned recently. One, with regard to the evolution of social values, now we are talking about how social values evolve across time and among groups, social groups, and I think we have learned recently 2 major points. One is that the evolution is not linear, and I think that, especially with regard, for example, with the environmental agenda, for a long time we thought that, well, there was kind of slow but progressive rise of environmental concerns that was started as associated with the left, but progressively in Western countries, but progressively also was incorporated to the right. But with Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, we have seen that there could be actually a very rapid recreation on the environmental agenda, and very aggressive and very rapid recreation. So, and also with regard to, for example, women's rights, that's what's going on in Europe now, or in Texas, that recently approved a law forbidding abortion, that was a kind of major regression in the, and what with progressive people think that it's the right way of, of the evolution of social values with regards to women's reproductive rights. So we have learned that there could be very rapid regressions, but also we have learned that that maybe we are leading to a very polarized society. So if you look at the US, for example, with regard to negationism to the vaccine, or also to climate change, the positions about climate change, what we see is a very radical polarization of opinions, and it has to do with the configuration of social groups and how to develop the political values. And so, and of course, that has many implications for environmental global governance. For example, the fact that the US is part of the Paris Agreement or not. It depends if one government signs it and the other unsign it, and depending on who wins, that will have major consequences for the global environment. So I think that these 2 points, as social scientists, we have to be, to pay attention to that, and to think that what is, we talk about the youth, for example, what we have to ask the question of which youth, from which social group, and from which part of the world, and that's a key issue.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got one more question, and Juha is ready to answer it, so I can read it. Yeah. And is there any question in the audience, in the room? I just forgot to ask. Because we have a few minutes left. Okay, so then I read the question. General question about paradigms. Hasn't there already been a major paradigm shift towards stronger ecological emphasis, especially among youth and young adults, as just stated? To me, it seems that currently this new paradigm is simply struggling to transfer to reality because of the existing economic social structures. I wonder if you have any thought on this, whether we really need more or a future shift in a paradigm or a change in tangible societal structures? That's a question, please. Very short, if you may.
Yeah, I'm sure that all the other panelists here have something to say on this, and I definitely do not have an answer. Okay. Because this was a big one. But just an example, because I'm working on the ground, and what I've noticed, I go to a shop, grocery store, and I find now I'm speaking about my hometown in Turku, and in Finland, I see walls of vegetarian food and vegan food. So that's an indication that 2 years ago that didn't exist, and now it exists. So already there's a social norm or some sort of pressure moving people towards that direction. It may need, as I also indicated in my talk, that it necessarily needs some structural changes or institutional changes to shift habits to that direction. But it's already ongoing. So I do agree with this, Katarina, that change is already ongoing, and you just open your eyes and you find yourself choosing more wisely. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Tatiana, can I say something?
Shortly, yes, please. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be really brief. I think this diagram behind is obviously an oversimplification. I've drawn one system, and there's multiple nested systems in here. There's sort of the food system, the climate system, blah, blah, blah. And when we talk about paradigms, that means there's also multiple paradigms. And some of them are more overarching than others. So yes, we're seeing a shift in people's behaviors. We see a no-fly movement. We see people shifting to veganism. But all of these practices are still embedded within our neoliberal capitalist economy, and that shapes our consumption. So a lot of these sort of sustainable consumption paradigms are still consumption. And so they're still shaped within this particular paradigm that also then shapes the structures. And I think that if we're looking for deeper societal change, we really have to be thinking about, okay, which are the paradigms that we need to be thinking about to create deeper sustainability change here.
Yeah.
Tatiana, I can
Oh, I
directly
mean,
add to
we have to finish now.
Julia's,
So I think that it's very nice to finish with the female voice. So thank you, Julia, very much. And I like to thank you very much all. I think, of course, we can somewhere continue in this interesting discussion, but time is running and we have to close this session because we have in front of us a final plenary and we need to get ready for that. I like to thank you also, as Juha is already here in person, so I like to take him also with a present that he already knows, but you don't know, guys, who is it? So then listen. This is a very typical Slovak toy, and he's getting as a for kind of present and conference. You get it by post, okay? So just let you know that it's also waiting for you. So thank you very much also for the questions and everybody to come here, okay? So have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.